recently purchased for $123 an old school exercise item, variously called the Iron Horseshoe, the Iron Shoe, the Iron Shoe Strength Builder, among other names. Most people would pass this up at a thrift shop for $10, but they are fairly rare, it appears, and their presence on the internet, as few as they are, is mostly in a for sale context. Recently, one sold, this one, at eBay for nearly $450, including tax and shipping. There are at least a couple of different versions of the Iron Horseshoe, one even being made in Europe today, but I'll focus here on this one. Mine was slightly rusty when I got it. I cleaned it up with WD-40 and a soft wire brush, and it looks wonderful and works fine. This particular version that I have is generally attributed to George Jowett, an influential weightlifting entrepreneur in the 1920s and 1930s, or the York Barbell Company later. Jowett's company that first sold this Iron Horseshoe was called the American Athletic Appliance Company. This firm existed in the Depression-era 1930s. More about that business in a minute. Jowett was producing exercise objects, including presumably the earliest adjustable plate dumbbell, patented in 1928, a bit earlier before the initiation of the York Barbell Company, which was founded in 1932 by Bob Hoffman. Jowett's and York's production of the Iron Horseshoe, by superficial look and photographs on the internet, appear to be exactly the same. Neither has any identification on the object by stamps or markings. What's the story about them? And is there a way to tell the Jowett and the York from one another? There is some commentary about the Iron Horseshoe online by different people, some with considerable expertise on vintage weightlifting equipment. But no one goes very deeply into discerning the Jowett from the York versions. Golden Era Bookworm, a site with a lot of interesting information about vintage exercise objects, says that the original Jowett version didn't have a chain. But the Golden Era site, as informational as it is, doesn't note the source of evidence for this assertion. In fact, that internet site sells a reprint of Jowett's text about exercising with the Iron Horseshoe, and the cover image shows that exercise object with a chain. There are also ads and catalogs in the 1930s for Jowett's American Athletic Appliance Company Iron Horseshoe that also depicts the chain. I've yet to find anyone online, studied experts or not, ever mentioning the measuring device attached to my version of the Iron Horseshoe. There are two parts to this, a measuring plane and a movable needle. Because this gauge is so crudely made, at first I thought it was a do-it-yourself creation by whoever bought the original Horseshoe. But the two pieces of this rough gauge fit inside two channels, grooves, and the main iron parts of the Horseshoe, and I eventually found another Iron Horseshoe photograph online, rusty, but the only one I've run across so far with the same gauge that I had on mine. This particular Iron Horseshoe is evidenced in a past for sale context in Texas, proving that my thin gauge was an original part, at least on some of the old Iron Horseshoes. All other photographs of the Iron Horseshoe that I've been able to find presented online either never had this part or it has broken off. That fact is never mentioned by people discussing or selling the old Iron Horseshoe on the internet. Likely the issue of the missing gauge is usually never even realized. This Iron Horseshoe at the Old Time Strongman website is said to be a Jowett version. The author doesn't cite his evidence for that, for anyone to discern the difference between a Jowett or York. Clearly, this one never had a measurement gauge, or it is missing. This measuring gauge on the exerciser I own at close inspection is made of a different metal material than the rest of the solid iron object. It is thin, and it appears to be fairly brittle, and is likely to be easily broken. As one strains to use the Iron Horseshoe, pulling the handles apart, you can look at this measuring device, which has a kind of needle gauge, and see your relative strength progress. Most interestingly, both gauge parts appear to be handcrafted, not machine-made. The pieces are not symmetrical, nor are they exactly straight-lined. There is a crudeness to them. This hints to me that perhaps my Iron Horseshoe is an early version. possibly the Jowett. I have in my possession a small American athletic appliance catalog, Jowett's company. The catalog is undated. An iron horseshoe is depicted inside by a drawing for sale. Noteworthy, the image gauge with its little needle, looking closely, is clearly shown in the image. Here is a 1980 York catalog. There's no date on it, but two references to York magazine publications, Strength and Health and Muscular Development, inside are dated 1980. The iron horseshoe was still being sold then by York, exactly the same, at least superficially, as the original Jowett, but there is no evidence here of the protruding measurement gauge. Somewhere over the years, that part had obviously stopped being manufactured. It is claimed online by some commentators that the two springs on the iron horseshoe can be removed, to vary difficulty in pulling it apart. The one I own doesn't afford the option of removing either spring. Someone has pounded the ends of the bolts, slightly bending them so the nut won't screw off. Was this done by an individual owner, or was this how the exerciser originally came? Might this be another point of distinction between the Jowett and the York, that the original Jowett didn't allow the one or two spring variants, as well as the presence of the measurement gauge, which perhaps later versions don't have? Certainly, at least some Yorks. Whatever the case, the Jowett iron horseshoe is probably considerably rarer than the York, not only because it is older, but also because Jowett was producing and advertising them in the 1930s during the catastrophic depression, although York appeared to have piggybacked the original towards the end of the depression. No doubt few had the luxury money to buy these things in those days, and Jowett wrote in a letter that early in the Depression, already by 1931, he was economically ruined, proclaiming that, quote, "I am broke worse than ever in my life," unquote. Here's a 1937 stock certificate for Jowett's American Athletic Appliance Company, sold at eBay a while ago. Economically struggling sometime in this 1930s period, Jowett must have cut some sort of deal with the York Company. In fact, Jowett worked for York's Strength and Health magazine for a couple years in the early 1930s, until an acrimonious falling out with York's owner, Bob Hoffman. In this April 1933 issue of Strength and Health magazine, owned by York, George Jowett was its publisher. Within it, there's an ad for the exerciser in question, here called the German Iron Shoe Muscle Builder, and the address to write to get it was Jowett's American Athletic Appliance Company, not available yet through York. And the ad includes the so often missing measuring gauge. At some point in the 1930s, Jowett lost American Athletic Appliance to creditors in New York. At some point, too, whether legitimately, exploitively, or by rip-off, York apparently took over the marketing of Jowett's Iron Horseshoe, claiming it by default as York's own. By 1939, for example, there were ads in York's Strength and Health magazine, like here, advertising the Iron Horseshoe with no mention of the American Athletic Appliance Company, although the drawn image in the ads depicted exactly former advertisement images for the Jowett device. With so many people broke, few people were spending much money, and the Jowett Iron Horseshoe was probably pretty rare in the 1930s Depression era, and this rarity probably somewhat continued during World War II metal scarcity to the public, per rationing during 1941-1945. Jowett's company's possession of the Iron Horseshoe was long gone, but York continued to produce the exercise item at least until 1980, as depicted in this York catalog. Whether continuously or off and on, I don't know. Lastly, of note, per Jowett's Philadelphia company, American Athletic Appliance, the Stark Center Archive at the University of Texas has a lot of original Jowett documents, including a September 1933 Certificate of Incorporation in Pennsylvania for this Jowett firm. He was involved in more than one entrepreneurial enterprise over the years, but this particular company was around before 1933, at least as early as 1930. Here's a May 1930 ad for the company in an old magazine called Science and Technology. The firm was advertising a so-called newly invented device called the peerless leg developer, but it doesn't depict what that actually is or even looks like. Rather, there's a drawn image of a muscular leg. I can't find any information online about this peerless leg developer. Again, in 1930, when this ad was published, Jowett was embarking upon selling exercise objects as the Great Depression began getting worse. I can compare my own undated American Athletic Appliance catalog to the one online, the Internet one dated 1937, and my undated catalog, the Iron Horseshoe, sold for $5. But in the 1937 issue of the catalog, the selling price is $3.50. At first I presumed that the higher price inferred that, logically, my catalog was later than 1937, but I wondered if this Jowett company survived much longer than 1937, and given the volatile economics of the 1930s depression, it's possible that his exercise objects were difficult to sell, and that the price of the Iron Horseshoe went down in later years, and my catalog predates the 1937 version. The average U.S. income in 1939, near the end of the Depression, was $1,368 a year for those who had jobs. The average hourly wage was about 50 cents an hour for workers in the manufacturing trades. 50 cents an hour equals about $11.27 an hour today. The Iron Horseshoe wasn't very cheap back then, surely a luxury for those many facing economic hardship and restraints during the Great Depression. So who knows? Maybe over time someone will come up with some hard evidence proving absolutes about who made which Iron Horseshoe version, York or Jowett, and when. Or what, at least, was the business arrangements between these two companies, overlapping in selling, it may be, at least for a while, the exact same thing. Except, perhaps, for the mysterious and often missing measurement gauge. My excuse for this pitiful effort is that the springs must have frozen up after so many years of probable unuse. I hope.